you didn't hear him speak to us 4 years ago, you may have read his book, What is a Life Worth? Or you may have read the Washington Post profile last September, which came out in conjunction with the new movie based on his work with the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, it's called Worth, starring Michael Keaton. We could ask him, what is Michael Keaton really like? But you may know that over the course of his career, he's worked on Capitol Hill. He was worked with Ted Kennedy's office. He was actively involved in things like the compensation funds for Virginia Tech, the BP oil spill, Penn State, Sandy Hook, Aurora, Colorado, all these incredible events that have required a response from body public of the United States to deal with these tragedies. And he's been in the middle of it, and he's worked pro bono for the most part. And he is very involved in so many different things that he has won numerous awards for leadership and public service. But not only is Ken famous, he is also kind, generous, and wise. And so it's our opportunity this afternoon to hear Ken Feinberg talk to us about his work. Kenneth, welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very, very much, Shelley. My mother would be very pleased to hear that introduction, I think. I want to thank you. I want to thank Nancy. I want to thank Dick. I want to thank everybody at Rotary, DC for staying after me and inviting me to participate for a few minutes. I want to tell you at the outset why I was eager to respond to the invitation and participate in chatting with you guys for a few minutes. You know, I grew up in Brockton, Massachusetts, blue-collar town. And when I was a teenager, President Kennedy was president of the United States. And I'll always remember a couple of comments that President Kennedy made that ring awfully true to Rotary, DC. He said at the time that serving the public interest is a noble undertaking. And then he added, every single individual in our country can make a difference. Now, I'm not saying he was talking about you and Rotary DC, but I'll tell you what I find so rewarding about your work. You know, when I do one of these programs that Shelley mentions, like 9/11 or BP, or the shootings at Virginia Tech or at Aurora, Colorado, or the Pulse nightclub terrorist attack in Orlando, Florida, I'm asked by a Congress, a governor, an attorney general, a mayor, a governor to come in, design a program to compensate victims, and then close the file. I'm done, over, finished. But you guys at Rotary, every day, 24/7, 365 days a year, you are out there serving the public interest. And there's not enough Rotaries in this country, and there's not enough Rotary DCs in this country that can help breathe life into what President Kennedy was talking about when he spoke about public service. So I'm enormously grateful to you for the invitation. Now, let me give you just a few, just from 30,000 feet, really, a summary of what Shelley was talking about when I get involved. Every once in a while in public life, not often, fortunately, these tragedies that we read about in our country don't occur every day. But every once in a while, there is a tragedy where our elected officials or our appointed officials, like the Attorney General or a judge, will contact me. Ken, We want you to design and administer a compensation program to provide some degree of financial assistance to the victims and/or survivors of a tragedy like 9/11, the BP oil spill, the Boston Marathon bombings, and these other tragedies. Now, the programs will be voluntary. There's no requirement that victims or eligible claimants accept the money. But we want you to set up and administer such a program. And that's what I've done. That's what Shelley was talking about when he listed some of the tragedies where, take 9/11, where President Bush and Attorney General John Ashcroft, or the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, President Obama, call, Ken, we want you to come in, design the program, administer it, and provide compensation to all those who satisfy the criteria. So in 9/11, that fund was established by Congress 13 days after the 9/11 attacks. And over the life, the 33 months of that program, I distributed to survivors or families of the dead, the airplanes, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, I distributed public taxpayer money, a little over $7 billion, to 5,300 victims or survivors or family members, all taxpayer money. In the Boston Marathon bombings on Patriots Day, Mayor Menino of Boston and Governor Deval Patrick asked me, Ken, you're from Brockton, 18 miles from Boston. Please come in and design and administer a compensation program. Voluntary private donations totaling $62 million, 100,000 contributors, businesses and individuals. We want you to distribute that money to 4 families who lost loved ones and 240 physically injured victims. In these programs, I don't decide whether there should be a program. Others do that. I have no say in that at all. If I get a call, it's because they've decided they want to do a program. A decision's been made, and now they have to figure out how to distribute the funds. And that's when I get the call, you see. Now, a few important, I think, comments about all of these programs. First, they are aberrations. Normally, in our country, if a wronged innocent victim wants compensation, they hire a lawyer and they go to court. You choose your lawyer, I'll choose my lawyer, judge and jury will decide. But occasionally, the public is so overwhelmed by a tragedy that they take it upon themselves, or their elected officials do, to set up a special program. That's what I do. Second, I've learned over the years an important point about America that Rotary DC has known for years. Never underestimate the charitable impulse of the American people. It is astounding to me how, after tragedy, the American people step up on their own and send in money to fund these programs. I mean, the idea that in 60 days, the Boston Marathon bombing fund collected $62 million, $1 million a day, unheard of. No country on earth. I think it goes back to the Puritans in New England in the 17th century, the city on a hill. And I think that charitable impulse is part of our character, and a very, very important part of that character. Next point I want to emphasize. These programs are all apolitical. It's not red state, blue state, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. These programs that I've administered haven't got a political tinge. It's one national community coming to the aid of fellow citizens. And if that isn't refreshing, I don't know what is. I have grave doubts in my mind that a 9/11 type fund using all taxpayer money, not airline money, not World Trade Center money, taxpayer money. I have grave doubts that today in modern America, you could ever get political consensus to even set up a program like that. But it is particularly important to study the 9/11 Fund as an example of what Rotary DC stands for, an example of public citizen response to an unfathomable tragedy. That's an important point. Another point I want to make, Shelley mentions the movie Worth that is now showing on Netflix. Michael Keaton plays Ken Feinberg. And the story is all about my memoir, What is Life Worth? And it's all about the design and administration of the 9/11 Fund. And I'm asked all the time two questions. What's the lesson we learn from watching that film, Worth, on Netflix? Well, what you learn is, especially young people who don't remember 9/11, there was a time only 20 years ago when our nation stepped up as one, not polarized, as one. And the Congress immediately enacted the law creating the fund. I'm also asked by people, I must say, how did Michael Keaton do in portraying Ken Feinberg? Well, Michael Keaton's a great actor, and I think he did a fine job. But if you ask my children what they think of the film, they'll say, Dad, Michael Keaton did a fine job. It's a good movie, but he ought to stick with Batman or Beetlejuice. He doesn't capture the essence of our father. Well, that's what you would expect from your children. So that's all right. But overall, I think the film, much to my surprise, actually, does, I think, accurately portray what we were up against and the challenges we confronted. Because you see, and this is the next to last point I want to make in my comments. People ask me all the time in all of these programs that Shelley listed, what's the toughest part of what you do? Is it calculating the amount of money that you'll give to each victim? No. That is not rocket science, I must say. Judges and juries every day in every court throughout the United States do that day in and day out. What would the victim have earned over a work life? What about pain and suffering? Judges and juries make those calculations, and in the 9/11 Fund, I'm asked to do it, so I do it. But it's not, you need a calculator and certain assumptions about how long an individual would work or make a living. That's not the tough part. The tough part in all of these programs is the emotion. The emotion in dealing directly and individually with people in grief who have lost loved ones. I mean, it's debilitating, you see. It's absolutely debilitating. Couple of examples. 9/11. A woman, 26 years old, she came to see me privately, sobbing. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. And he left me with our two children, 6 and 4. Now, you're going to award me $2.2 million for the death of my husband. I want it in 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, this is public taxpayer money. I've got to go down to the US Treasury with your claim. It might be 60 days. It might be 90 days, but you'll get the money. No, 30 days. I said to her, Mrs. Jones, why do you need the money in 30 days? Why? I'll tell you why, Mr. Feinberg. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband was going to survive me and take care of our 2 children. Now they're going to be orphans. Now I have got to get this money while I still have my faculties. I've got to set up a trust. I've got to get the appointment of a guardian. I don't have a lot of time. Help me. Well, we ran down to the Treasury. We walked the check through the bureaucracy. We got it to her in 30 days. 8 weeks later, she died. Now, that is the horrifying difficulty when you take on these cases, you see. The emotional overhang is absolutely debilitating. A woman came to see me after 9/11, sobbing. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband at the World Trade Center. He was a fireman. When the planes hit the World Trade Center, my husband saw 20 people who were trapped in the lobby of the World Trade Center. He ran in, saved all 20 of them, and brought them to safety. He turned back and he saw that another 20 were trapped. He ran into the lobby a second time, brought them to safety. While he was running across the World Trade Center plaza, he was killed by someone who jumped from the 103rd floor of the World Trade Center and hit him like a missile. Mr. Feinberg, if my husband had taken one step either way, he'd be here today. But somebody leapt to their death, hit him, and killed them both. Now, Mr. Feinberg, don't tell me there's a God. There's no God who would allow this to happen to my husband. It's stories like that, you see, in every one of these tragedies that make the job so debilitating. And now here's my last philosophic point, and then maybe we have time for a question or two, although Shelley, I think, is a tough taskmaster, who's ever, or maybe President Bill is going to be a tough taskmaster, I don't know. But here's the last point I want to make about all of these programs. You see, take 9/11. I think the 9/11 fund was a great idea. I think it exemplified the best of America. I think it worked just as Congress intended. By all accounts, I defend it as a success. Don't ever do it again. Don't ever create another 9/11 fund with taxpayer money. You see, bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's no 9/11 fund. I didn't see a 9/11 type fund after the bombings in Oklahoma City, a domestic terrorist. I don't see any taxpayer funded individual compensation after floods or tornadoes or volcanoes or earthquakes. Why just 9/11? No, I think 9/11 was okay. It was a unique response to a unique American tragedy. But you better be careful about singling out special generous compensation with public money just for a select few. Everybody else, hire your lawyer, go to court. It's a very, very dangerous, slippery slope if you start thinking about government as a compensation source of first resort. You should have read some of the letters I received during my administration of the 9/11 fund. Dear Mr. Feinberg, my son died in Oklahoma City, the victim of the Murrah bombing by a domestic terrorist. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't get it. My daughter died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same type of people. Why aren't I eligible? And it wasn't just terrorism, you see. Dear Mr. Feinberg, last year, my wife saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned of heroin. Where's my check? Better be careful about creating these well-intentioned programs for just a certain number of people. Everybody else, you're on your own. Hope you have life insurance. But for these people, we'll be very, very generous. So 9/11, to me, is better studied in a history class, not in a law school or in a political science class, because I think it's a precedent for nothing. It's a one-off, just like the attacks hopefully were a one-off. Anyway, so that is my 22-minute opening statement. I hope I get high grades from those who invited me. And I'm told we want to save maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
We do.
And so I send it back to you guys.
Thank you very much, Ken. We really appreciate the fascinating remarks. And we do have some questions for you. I want to start actually, because what you just talked about, this singular response, reminded me, and as you were talking, I was reminded of one of our basic tenets of Rotary is it fair to all concerned? Is it fair to all concerned? And you touched on that issue of fairness in a big sense with regard to that. But I'm wondering, what have you learned about administering fairness in a situation like this, which requires these judgments?
That is a fabulous question that could occupy a philosophy seminar for an entire semester.
I'm sure.
I will say this in response to your question. These programs are not fair. They are not just. And it's very, very, it's unfortunate if people label these programs as fair or just, because what's fair about providing a check, money, for someone who's lost a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife? I instead use a word like mercy rather than fairness or justice, because if you try and defend what I do on grounds of fairness or justice, I think you're going to find yourself behind the 8 ball. To me, these programs are merciful in providing some financial certainty to victims, but I'm not prepared to defend them as fair or just. That I'm not prepared to do.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a great answer, interesting answer. I'm going to turn now to Monica Smith for another question. Monica.
Hi, I remember you coming to talk to the club several years ago, and you were still one of my favorite speakers. You're just amazing. And
you must have been 10 years old at the time.
What I wonder is, how do you, I mean, you have such a unique skill set for this work, and obviously you're asked a lot to do this, but you can't do it forever. So how do you train people to follow in your footsteps? Because you have this, to me, amazing combination of not only legal, political, financial knowledge, but especially the psychological empathy and knowing how to work in these situations and being so self-aware about this isn't always fair, right? That, as you just said. So what kind of people do you recruit to help you, and who do you hope can follow you?
Well, let me just say, and I'm not kidding about this, I think the people that will follow me are the people like you guys that do it every day. Now, The secret, it seems to me, as to the person who'll be eligible to do it when I don't do it anymore, will be a person who can brace herself or himself to the emotional wave that you get. It's not difficult to decide who gets what. It isn't. You don't ask, in calculating awards, I don't ask people about loyalty, dignity, love, integrity. Those are questions that should be asked by a rabbi or a priest. I want to know, what was he making at the time? What was she earning? What about a pension? And, but it's the emotional part of this that everybody can't take it. It is not easy to listen to hearing after hearing after hearing. I lost my wife. And here's an interesting thing. You guys will appreciate this. Very few people come to see me after a tragedy to talk about money. Very few. They come to either vent about life's unfairness, anger, life's unfairness, and they take it out on the administrator, or they come to validate the memory of a lost loved one. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my wife. We were married for 25 years. She died in the World Trade Center. I want to show you privately a video of our wedding 25 years ago. Well, Mr. Jones, you don't have to do that. It'll be very emotional. I want you to watch. I want you to see what those murderers did to my angel. Show the film. It is the ability, I think, and I bet you there are plenty of people in this country that can pick up where I leave off, including people on at this meeting, who can brace themselves and empathize with the victims.
Thank you much for that question. And now we're going to turn to Bill Day for a quick question. We have a long line. We're not going to get to them all, but Bill Day, you're next.
I wonder if perhaps rather than looking at fairness, it makes sense to look at other policy reasons for this kind of distribution fund. And I think particularly of the vaccine injury fund, where if we imposed classical liability on the vaccine manufacturers because of the low profit margin on vaccines, we would have no vaccines because nobody would make them. The bottom line wouldn't be met. So can you comment on maybe application of that standard for the creation of these funds, like other public policy reasons?
Oh, that's absolutely right. There are programs that are first cousins of some of these programs, like the 9/11 fund. Vaccine injury is a perfect example. If you suffer an injury as a result of the vaccine, an allergic reaction, let's say, do not hire a lawyer and go to court. There's a law, a federal law that says vaccine injuries mandate, it's not voluntary, mandate that you go to this special fund, like a workers' comp fund, where you'll receive some money, but it won't be like a court award, but you avoid lawyers, you avoid delays, you avoid uncertainty, file. There are programs like that, not many, but you're right. There are policy reasons, like no one will make the vaccine, no manufacturer, Pfizer, Moderna, they're not going to make these vaccines if they think they're going to suffer, thousands of lawsuits that'll bankrupt them. So we have a special alternative pathway to compensate the relatively rare case where the vaccine itself is defective, not, well, I went and I got the virus. That's not that, you're out of luck. But there are policy reasons, just as you stated, where it's important to encourage the manufacture of these public health vaccines by incentivizing companies. You won't face lawsuits, and that's important. You're right.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Sheldon Ray, who I think gets the last question today. I know there are others. Sorry about that, guys. Sheldon, over to you.
It's actually my daughter, Betsy.
Hi.
I'm a guest of Rotary today, probably for the first time since I was about 13. It's been a few years, but thank you, Ken, for speaking. It's been really interesting. The question I have for you today is around, I think, how you see, I think we were just talking about sort of similar funds and similar initiatives, something that I hope is coming up in conversations more recently and certainly is around reparations, which I think have some parallels to like the 9/11 fund. I just saw in the news that Canada announced a $31.5 billion settlement for the impact of the boarding schools on Indigenous children. So I'm curious to hear sort of your perspective on that. Are those things that should go through the legal system? Are those things that, could be approached in a similar way as the 9/11 fund? Curious to hear your thoughts.
If what you're suggesting is how viable and credible is a compensation fund for victims of slavery, I read about these funds that are being thought about today. And I think a reparations program for slavery, at least in the United States, is incredibly unlikely, very, very unlikely. And that's because the impact of slavery in this country is so pronounced. It's so much a part of our heritage. I have no idea how you would fund or set up such a program. For example, who's eligible? Who's eligible to even be considered? Now, you might say, well, let's limit the fund to those current Afro-Americans who can demonstrate or prove a link to a relative, great-great-grandfather, mother, who were slaves. First of all, what if a person can't prove it, but knows it or is convinced of it? Just can't prove it. There's no evidence. Secondly, if you tell members of the African-American community that the only people eligible are those who can trace their heritage back to a slave, what about all the Afro-Americans, the Tulsa race riots of 21, the lynching of Blacks during Jim Crow era? What about all those victims who aren't necessarily traced back to slavery, but nevertheless can demonstrate the vicious impact of race in American society? And who's going to pay for this? So I'm intrigued by the idea, and I can understand the attitude of those who want it. But I think the practical challenges to reparations for slavery in America overwhelm the possibility, the potential. So I don't see it. Now, reparations for other more well-defined disasters, there have been programs, those workers who suffered cancer and radiation sickness because they helped make the atomic bomb back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So they set up a special reparations fund for them. Yeah, there are occasions of that, well-defined. And but it's an interesting discussion. Perhaps you and I will pursue it going forward.
President Bill, over to you.
Bill, before you do that, could I say one thing to Ken? Thank you again. I want you to know what your reference to studying this event is so important, that my grandson, who is currently in college, heard you at an Osgood program, took a freshman seminar on 9/11, had his class watch Worth, and they spent 2 days discussing what it meant to them as citizens.
Oh, that's great. Tell him thank you. I guess that's one reason why Worth is still in the top 10 watchable on Netflix. So I appreciate that, if for no other reason. So
we had 100 people watching that movie with you, sir, and I thank you for that.
I must say at the end of this, I'm turning it right back to the president, but I must say again, everybody, I want to thank you. It's an honor for me to be invited to join for a few minutes with people who are laboring in the vineyard every day to give something back to the community. And I just think it's fabulous.
Ken, thank you so much. And we really appreciate your remarks today. So topical to so much that has happened in the last couple of decades. Look forward to checking out the film, Worth. Definitely going to do that. And appreciate your appreciation of Rotary and what we do.
Thank
Really
you,
do.
sir.
And last but not least, as you know, having been a prior speaker, we have a tradition of planting a tree in the honor of each of our speakers. If we were in person, as we'd hoped to be today, I'd be handing you a tree certificate. But in any case, we will notify you of when we'll be doing our next planting ceremony. And something new from the last time, we now are able to provide GPS coordinates. So we actually assign a tree with your name. All right.
Will do.
So
Thank you.
thank you again.